December 15, 1944. The cold came down like a punishment from heaven. It wasn't a gentle snowfall, nor the storybook kind that softened the world into beauty. It was a brutal, skin-cutting freeze that seemed to silence even the guns. Outside Munich, a prisoner transit camp stood half-buried under snowdrifts taller than a man. The barbed wire glittered like crystal, the guard towers were sheathed in ice, and every breath turned instantly to frost. Within those fences, hundreds of German women, nurses, clerks, and factory workers captured during the Allies' advance, shivered in threadbare gray dresses that had once been uniforms. They huddled in wooden barracks where the wind slipped through every crack. The air smelled faintly of smoke and damp straw. At the Southern Watch Post, Sergeant Michael O'Connor rubbed his gloved hands together, watching the white plains stretch endlessly toward the Bavarian hills. He was 32, a rancher from Abilene, Texas, who had spent more winters mending fences in dust storms than fighting in snow. His accent was slow, his eyes steady, and his sense of right and wrong unbending. War had stripped him of much: friends, cattle, sleep, but not that. He'd been sent here with a detachment of U.S. Army Guards, most of them country boys, to oversee a group of surrendered female personnel from the collapsing German rear. They were told it was a temporary facility. Nothing about it felt temporary. The cold made time stop. Private Tommy Williams, the youngest of O'Connor's men, stomped his boots by the guardhouse stove. He was 20, broad-shouldered and sunburned even in the Bavarian winter, his humor unkillable. "Sarge," he muttered, "I reckon the cows back home are warmer than we are." O'Connor grinned faintly. "Cows got more sense than us, boy. They'd have found a way south." Across the yard, the women moved stiffly between the barracks, clutching each other for balance on the ice. Most wore makeshift scarves torn from their own skirts. Some carried buckets of snow, hoping to melt it for water. A few still tried to keep a soldier's dignity, walking upright despite the trembling. O'Connor noticed one among them, a young nurse with straw-blonde hair poking from her headscarf, perhaps in her mid-20s. She kept checking the hands of those around her, rubbing them, whispering something he couldn't hear. Compassion was a strange luxury in that place. The army had not planned for women prisoners, not like this. Supplies were short everywhere. Blankets and coats were issued by rank, not mercy. Headquarters orders were clear: maintain discipline, avoid fraternization, ensure survival within protocol. But protocol didn't tell a man what to do when he saw frost forming on a girl's eyelashes. The Red Cross truck was overdue by 3 days, and the last batch of rations had arrived frozen solid. The guards shared what coffee they could, but even boiling water was a fight against physics. That night the wind worsened. It howled across the camp, shaking the tin roofs until they groaned. Inside the guard hut, the men played cards by the dim light of a lantern. Williams dealt a hand, but O'Connor didn't play. He kept staring out the window, where the snow had begun to erase the footprints between barracks. "They'll freeze," he said quietly. No one answered at first. The thought hung in the air like breath that refused to fade. Finally, Corporal Hayes, a wiry man from Amarillo, spoke up. "Ain't our fault, Mike. They're prisoners. We keep 'em alive till orders change, that's it." O'Connor didn't argue, but something in him rebelled. He'd spent his life believing a man's worth was measured by how he treated the helpless. War had tested that belief every day, yet somehow it hadn't broken it. He thought of his wife back home, of her handwriting in the letters he still carried, how she told him, "Don't let this war turn you mean." The memory stung worse than the cold. Just before midnight, the lights went out across the camp. Power lines had frozen. The only illumination came from the moon reflecting off snow. From the dark yard came muffled cries, German voices, high-pitched and frightened. The guard stepped outside, rifles slung but unused. One of the barrack doors had blown open. Wind rushed in like a white ghost. O'Connor approached, snow up to his knees. Inside he found the prisoners packed together under straw, shaking violently. The air smelled of wet wool and fear. A woman at the far corner wasn't moving. Her friends were trying to wake her, but her skin had turned the color of paper. "She's gone," O'Connor said softly, his voice steady but hollow. Two more were close behind her. He stepped out into the night, pulled his scarf higher, and felt something heavy settle in his chest. He had seen death in combat, but this was different. This wasn't battle, it was neglect. The next morning the camp was silent except for the wind. The roll call was slower than usual. 3 names went unanswered. The German interpreter, a teacher before the war, translated the questions, but no one could speak through chattering teeth. The snow crunched beneath the guards' boots, loud in the emptiness. O'Connor stood beside the prisoners, not above them, and for a moment there was no line dividing captor and captive. They were all just people trying to outlast the cold. Williams shuffled closer. "Sarge," he whispered, "they can't last another night." O'Connor didn't reply, but his jaw tightened. He saw the nurse again. Ingrid, someone said her name was, trying to warm another woman's hands by blowing on them, her own fingers turning purple. O'Connor turned away before anyone saw the look on his face. In the mess tent, the men huddled over weak coffee. Their breath steamed in the air. Hay spoke first. "We can't keep going soft, Mike. Command'll skin us alive if we start handing out gear." O'Connor didn't look up. "I'm not talking about going soft," he said. "I'm talking about doing right." Williams smirked faintly. "You're fixin' to give him your coat, ain't you?" O'Connor didn't answer. He didn't need to. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days, casting long shadows across the snow. It didn't bring warmth, only light, a cruel kind that revealed everything too clearly. O'Connor stood at the edge of the yard, hands on his belt, watching the women gather around a smoking barrel. Their faces were hollow but proud. He saw no hatred there, only endurance. That evening he walked the perimeter one last time before lights out. The wind had quieted. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang from a frozen village. He stopped near the wire fence and glanced back at the barracks. For a moment, he imagined the desert back home. The smell of cedar, the creak of saddles, the way dawn looked over a Texas pasture. He had never thought those memories could make him feel guilty. He returned to the guard post and sat by the dying stove. Williams looked up from his cot. "You think God cares which side we're on, Sarge?" he asked. O'Connor thought about the question for a long time before answering. "Not tonight," he said finally. "Tonight he's watching who freezes and who don't." Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and relentless. It covered the footprints, the barbed wire, the wooden roofs, erasing the boundaries between them all. And as the storm thickened, the men inside the guardhouse exchanged glances that said what none of them dared speak aloud. They knew the rules. They also knew they couldn't keep them much longer. The dawn came slowly, pale and brittle, spreading across the snow like spilled milk. The camp was still half buried, the air sharp enough to sting the lungs. Sergeant O'Connor woke before reveille, not from habit but from worry. The frost had crept through the cracks in the guardhouse, forming thin white veins along the wooden walls. He rose, buttoned his coat tight and stepped outside. The wind had stilled, but the silence it left behind was heavier than any storm. Across the yard, the German women were already stirring, brushing snow off the roofs of their barracks, their movements slow, mechanical. Some coughed. Some simply stared into the whiteness as if expecting rescue to rise from it. Private Williams joined him, wrapping his scarf higher. "Looks worse than yesterday," he muttered. O'Connor didn't answer. His eyes followed one figure, the nurse, Ingrid Müller, bending to help an older woman stand. Ingrid's hands were bare, her fingers red and cracked. O'Connor could see her trembling even from where he stood. Something inside him snapped. He turned to Williams. "Fetch the boys," he said quietly. "All of them." They gathered inside the guardhouse, 6 men around a single stove that gave more smoke than heat. Steam rose from their breath as they spoke. O'Connor didn't bother with rank. 3 women froze last night, he said. We don't have enough blankets and headquarters ain't sending any. If this keeps up, more will die before week's end. He paused, letting the words sink in. Hayes leaned back, arms crossed. So what? We write another report? They don't even read the last ones. Williams looked between them, restless. Then we stop waiting for orders. O'Connor's tone was calm, but his eyes held fire. We got coats. They don't. I don't care who signed what protocol. I'm not watching people freeze when I've got something that can help. The room fell quiet. The men shifted uneasily, torn between duty and decency. Finally, Williams broke the silence. Sarge is right, he said. We give him something to get through tonight. The army'll make more coats. They can't make more lives. Hayes scoffed. You plan to explain that to command? Sorry, sir, gave all our gear to the enemy? They'll call it fraternizing. Might even call it treason. O'Connor's expression didn't change. Then they can freeze me too. They stood there for a moment, the sound of the wind creeping through the door. Then slowly, one by one, the men began unbuttoning their coats. The motion was quiet, deliberate, wool brushing against rough uniforms, belts unbuckling, buttons slipping free. The first to act was Williams, pulling his coat from his shoulders and folding it in his arms. Guess I'll start the paperwork then, he said with a crooked grin. Hayes rolled his eyes, but after a long breath, he followed suit. The rest came after wordlessly. Outside, the prisoners were lined up for inspection. Their breath hung like smoke in the frigid air. The guards stepped out from the hut, coatless, a strange sight even to their own eyes. Frost glinted on their uniforms. The women watched in silence as O'Connor walked toward them. No words were exchanged. He simply held out his coat to the nearest woman, a frail clerk with gray in her hair and fingers shaking too badly to reach for it. When she finally did, her face crumpled. Williams followed, handing his to Ingrid, who froze in disbelief. For a second she didn't move, as if unsure whether it was a trick. Then, with a trembling hand, she accepted it, pressing it to her chest. The yard went still. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Dozens of eyes, German and American alike, watched the act unfold. Some of the women began to cry silently, others bowed their heads, unsure how to react. One younger prisoner muttered a prayer in German. Another tried to salute, though her hands shook too hard to finish. O'Connor felt every gaze like a weight on his back. He turned to his men. That's enough, he said simply. Get back inside before you freeze your fool selves. But as they turned, he caught a glimpse of Ingrid kneeling beside one of her sick companions, draping the coat over her instead of herself. The sight hit him harder than the cold ever could. By noon, word had spread through the camp. Even the interpreters whispered about it. The prisoner's demeanor changed, not joy but something quieter, steadier. They began sharing what little food they had, helping the guards shovel snow from the paths. The tension that had hung between them for weeks started to thin. That afternoon, O'Connor was summoned to the officer's tent. Captain Dillard, a stiff man from Ohio with a voice that carried authority like a badge, stared at him over a clipboard. You distributed U.S. military property to enemy personnel, Dillard said flatly. That's against standing order. O'Connor didn't flinch. Sir, I distributed coats to freezing women. I'll take the reprimand. Dillard leaned back, measuring him. You think you're some kind of hero? No, sir, O'Connor said quietly. Just tired of burying people I could have saved. The captain studied him for a long time, his jaw tight. Then he sighed. You're lucky this isn't a frontline post. I'll file it as a logistical misunderstanding. But don't expect me to defend it again. O'Connor saluted, but his expression remained calm, resolute. Outside, the sun was already fading. Williams met him halfway across the yard. Well, he asked. We still soldiers or outlaws? O'Connor cracked a faint smile. Both, I reckon. Williams laughed softly. Texas outlaws got a nice ring to it. The temperature dropped again by nightfall, but the camp felt different now. Fires burned in metal drums near the barracks, and the women huddled close, wrapped in the coats that still smelled faintly of tobacco and leather. Some even smiled, fleetingly, like people who'd forgotten how. Ingrid approached O'Connor as he finished his rounds. Her English was halting, but her tone was clear. "You give life," she said, touching her chest. "Danky." He nodded awkwardly, tipping his helmet. "Ain't nothin' to thank, ma'am. Just decent sense." But as she walked away, he found himself staring at the coat she wore, his coat, and wondering how something so small could feel so large. Later, in the guardhouse, the men joked to hide their discomfort. "Hope they send replacements soon," Hayes said, blowing into his hands. "My skin's startin' to learn the word frostbite." Williams grinned. "You'll live. We Texans are bred tough." "You're from Arkansas," Hayes shot back. "Close enough," Williams replied, and the laughter that followed was the first genuine warmth the hut had felt in days. As midnight neared, O'Connor wrote in his pocket journal, the pencil trembling in his hand. He didn't write about war or victory, just a single line. "Sometimes mercy's the only order worth breaking." He closed the notebook and set it beside the lantern. Outside, the wind picked up again, but softer this time, almost like a sigh. The camp lay in quiet equilibrium, the guards sleepless but content, the prisoners alive and wrapped in borrowed warmth. O'Connor stood by the window, watching the faint glow from the women's barracks. For the first time since arriving, the place didn't look like a prison. It looked almost human. He turned away, muttering under his breath, "We'll catch hell for this." But there was a trace of peace in his voice, and behind it, something else. A conviction that once a man has done the right thing, no punishment can touch him. The snow outside began to fall again, soft and endless, erasing the footprints of that morning, as if even the earth itself wanted to remember only the warmth. By the next morning, the snow had crusted over into glass, each step cracking like the sound of distant gunfire. The camp's silence was no longer peace, it was the heavy calm before consequences arrived. Sergeant O'Connor stood outside the guardhouse with his collar turned up, the wind slicing through his shirt. His men worked quietly, their faces drawn. They'd all heard the rumor. An inspection convoy was on its way from headquarters. Someone had reported the missing coats. No one said it aloud, but every man knew what it meant. The army had its rules, and the rules didn't care about compassion. The truck appeared just after noon, grinding through the snow, tires wrapped in chains that clanked like shackles. A cloud of exhaust followed it as it pulled into the yard. Out stepped a major with silver leaves on his cap and a face carved from cold authority. He didn't introduce himself. His eyes swept the camp, sharp and methodical, until they fell on the unmistakable sight of German women wrapped in U.S. Army coats. The colors, the insignias, even the stitching, proof enough. His mouth tightened. "Sergeant O'Connor," he said. "Report to the command tent." Inside, the heat from the small iron stove did nothing to thaw the tension. The major sat behind a folding table, his gloves still on. O'Connor stood at attention, hands behind his back, jaw locked. "Is it true you distributed government property to enemy personnel?" the major asked, voice low and steady. "Yes, sir." "On whose authority?" "My own, sir." The major's eyes narrowed. "You're aware that constitutes a violation of Standing Order 403 under the Geneva Convention protocols?" O'Connor hesitated. "I'm aware it saved lives, sir." The room went still. Even the stove seemed to stop crackling. The major rose, pacing slowly. "This is not Texas, Sergeant. This is the United States Army. We don't operate on sentiment." O'Connor's voice didn't waver. "With respect, sir, sentiment's the only reason we're still human." For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then the major sighed, long and controlled, like someone exhaling disappointment rather than anger. "You'll receive formal reprimand," he said. "And I'll expect those coats returned to inventory." O'Connor didn't answer. He knew the order couldn't be carried out, the women would die without them. "Dismissed," the major said. "And Sergeant, pray your mercy doesn't become contagious." O'Connor stepped out into the cold again, blinking against the light. The sky was the color of steel. Williams met him halfway, concern etched across his face. "Well?" he asked. "We in trouble?" O'Connor gave a grim half-smile. "Trouble's all we're in." That afternoon, the major's men began their inspection. They walked through the camp like auditors of morality, noting every improvised fire pit, every coat missing from the manifest. The prisoners stood silent, watching. Ingrid was among them, her expression calm but defiant, her arms folded inside O'Connor's old coat. When one of the officers tried to take it from her, she spoke, halting English, heavy accent but steady. "This coat, keep me alive. You take, I die." The officer hesitated, glancing toward the major, who barked, "Translate that." The interpreter complied. The words hung in the icy air like a challenge. For the first time, the Americans didn't look like victors. They looked like men caught between orders and conscience. The major turned sharply toward O'Connor. "You see what you've done?" he hissed. "You've blurred the lines. You've made them believe we're equals." O'Connor didn't flinch. "Maybe for one night we were." As evening fell, the convoy prepared to leave. The major's parting words were curt. "Expect written charges within the week." The truck roared away, leaving behind churned snow and an uneasy quiet. The men gathered in the guardhouse, exhausted. Hayes muttered, "Guess we'll all be wearin' prison stripes soon enough." Williams leaned back, rubbing his hands. "Ain't that a laugh? We save folks from freezin' and get court-martialed for it." He looked at O'Connor. "You think it was worth it, Sarge?" O'Connor poured himself a cup of bitter coffee, staring into the steam. "Ask me when the snow melts," he said. That night, as darkness swallowed the camp, O'Connor heard faint singing drifting from the prisoners' barracks. It wasn't a military song, but something older, melancholy and haunting like the wind through canyon walls. The women sang quietly, their voices blending with the crackle of fire. He couldn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. Gratitude, mourning, maybe both. Williams listened beside him, eyes distant. "Strangest thing I ever heard," he whispered. "Feels like a prayer." Days passed and the reprimand never came. Perhaps the paperwork froze somewhere along the chain of command. Or perhaps the major, despite himself, had seen something in the Texans' defiance that stayed his hand. But the cold didn't ease. The camp remained locked in ice, and soon new orders arrived. Prepare for a prisoner transfer. The roads had to be cleared, wagons repaired, supplies rationed. As they worked, O'Connor noticed how the guards and prisoners began to move in rhythm. Without orders, they shoveled snow side by side, shared what little warmth the fires offered. War's formality had melted into something simpler: survival. When a stove in the women's quarters broke, Williams and Hayes fixed it without being asked. Ingrid appeared with a tin of coffee grounds she'd been saving and pressed it into Williams's hand. "You keep warm too," she said softly. That evening the men gathered near the main gate. The sky glowed pale orange from the setting sun. O'Connor leaned on his rifle, watching the horizon. "Funny," he murmured. "Didn't think a place like this could teach a man anything but hate." Williams tilted his head. "What did it teach you?" O'Connor smiled faintly. "That mercy's heavier than a rifle, but worth carryinda." Then the wind shifted, carrying the smell of coming snow. It began as flakes, small and harmless, then thickened fast, another blizzard rolling in from the north. The guards scrambled to cover the fires, shouting orders. The storm came with a howl, erasing the world in white. Visibility dropped to nothing. Men shouted but couldn't see their own boots. The barracks groaned under the weight of snow. O'Connor fought through the wind toward the women's quarters, the cold biting through his thin uniform. He reached the door and forced it open. Inside, the women huddled together, faces pale in the dim light. Ingrid was at the center, tending to a young girl who'd fainted. The air reeked of smoke and fear. O'Connor dropped to his knees, helping them patch the gaps under the door with sacks and straw. "Keep that fire going," he ordered, his voice rough. "Don't let it die no matter what." Ingrid met his eyes for a moment, then nodded. "We won't." Outside, Williams and Hayes battled to keep the generator running, the wind tearing at their sleeves. The storm lasted through the night, the kind that swallowed sound and reason alike. When dawn finally broke, weak and gray, the camp still stood. The roofs sagged, the fences leaned, but everyone, guards and prisoners, was alive. Williams stumbled toward O'Connor, frost clinging to his eyebrows. "Blizzard's done, Sarge. Not one soul dead." O'Connor looked around the camp, at the figures emerging from the snow like ghosts, and felt a strange warmth bloom in his chest. "Then it was worth every damn coat," he said quietly. He turned toward the horizon, where the convoy tracks from the major's truck were already half buried. The war would go on, orders would keep coming, and men like him would always walk the thin line between command and conscience. But as the wind died, he knew something had changed forever. The camp, once a symbol of division, had become something else entirely, a fragile truce carved out of frost and stubborn decency. O'Connor pulled his cap lower and glanced back at Ingrid, who stood by the fence, her borrowed coat flapping in the wind. She raised a hand in silent acknowledgement. He returned the gesture, brief but genuine. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the ache and the cold, he felt it, a quiet conviction that mercy once given never really dies. It only waits for the next storm to prove it's still alive. The blizzard had stripped the world of color. 3 days of howling wind and blinding white had buried the camp in silence, leaving only the faint groan of wood under snow. When it finally broke, the air hung still and sharp, like the pause between heartbeats. Sergeant O'Connor stood on the roof of the main barracks, shoveling the last of the ice away. His hands were raw, his face windburned, but his eyes carried the alert calm of a man who'd learned to survive anything. Below, the camp stirred back to life, slowly, uncertainly, as if afraid the storm might return at any moment. Smoke began to rise from the chimneys again. The prisoners emerged first, wrapped in the same American coats that had nearly cost the guards their freedom. Private Williams limped across the yard, dragging a broken shovel. "Storm took the supply tent," he muttered. "Half our rations gone." O'Connor nodded grimly. "We'll stretch what's left. We've done worse." Williams forced a grin. "You mean back when we thought winter in France was cold?" O'Connor's eyes softened. "This ain't winter, Tommy. This is God's reminder that he still runs the clock." The women gathered near the fence, brushing snow from one another's hair. Their faces were pale but alive, their eyes brighter than before. Ingrid approached carrying a small metal pot. She held it out to O'Connor, steam curling from its rim. "Coffee," she said in hesitant English. "You take. You need." He looked at her, surprised. "Where'd you find beans?" "We make," she replied, tapping her chest. "From roasted grain. Not good, but warm." O'Connor took the pot, the warmth seeping into his hands. "Best coffee I ever had," he said, and meant it. For a fleeting second they both smiled, the kind of human smile that belonged nowhere near a prison camp. By noon the sky cleared, revealing a cold blue that felt too clean for war. Hayes and 2 others repaired the fence while the women helped clear snow from the pathways. The separation between guard and captive had thinned so much it seemed to vanish beneath the frost. But peace, O'Connor knew, never lasted long in war. That truth arrived in the form of an engine rumbling in the distance, a sound every soldier recognized. A truck. Military issue. It rolled into camp minutes later, wheels crunching over ice. The flag on its hood told them it wasn't supply, it was inspection. Again. Only this time, not from headquarters in Munich. This was higher. The kind of arrival that could erase careers. A colonel stepped out, flanked by 2 MPs, his boots polished even in the slush. He wasted no words. "Where's your commanding officer?" O'Connor stepped forward. "That's me, sir. Acting." The colonel's gaze swept over the yard. His expression barely shifted, but the disapproval was clear. "I heard a story," he said, voice clipped, "that prisoners here wear our coats. Is that true?" O'Connor stood straighter. "Yes, sir." The colonel's jaw flexed. "Why?" "Because without them they'd be corpses." The man's eyes narrowed. "You think it's your place to decide who lives and dies?" O'Connor's tone stayed level. "Someone had to, sir. Command wasn't here." For a long moment the colonel said nothing. The wind picked up, carrying a torn flap of canvas across the yard. Then he turned to one of the MPs. "Take inventory. Every item, every coat." The soldiers moved toward the prisoners, notebooks in hand. As they began counting, one MP reached to pull the coat from an older woman's shoulders. She cried out softly, clutching it tighter. Ingrid stepped forward before she could stop herself, shouting something in German, sharp, emotional. The colonel spun around. "What did she say?" The interpreter hesitated. "She said, 'Please don't take life from us again.'" The colonel's eyes hardened. "This camp's gone soft," he said. "I see confusion of sides, of duty. You forget who you're fighting." O'Connor took a step closer, his voice low but steady. "I never forgot, sir. I just remembered who we were." The tension snapped taut as wire. For a moment, it seemed the colonel might have him arrested. But then something unexpected happened. One of the MPs, barely 20 and shaking from the cold, muttered under his breath, "Sir, if I may, these women ain't soldiers. They're civilians. They'd freeze without." The colonel cut him off with a glare. Yet the damage was done. The words hung in the air like a spark that refused to die. After a long silence, the colonel exhaled sharply. "I'll make my report," he said finally. "And I'll note a humanitarian context." His tone dripped with disdain. "But this camp remains under watch. If another violation occurs, Sergeant, it won't be leniency that follows." He turned, signaling his men to leave. The truck rattled out of sight, leaving only churned snow and exhaust in its wake. Williams exhaled slowly. "You think he'll actually write us up?" "Doesn't matter," O'Connor said. "We're still breathing. So are they. That's all I care about." He looked toward the barracks, where Ingrid and the others had already gone back to work, shoveling snow, rebuilding fires. The wind tugged at his sleeve, and for the first time in months, it didn't feel like punishment. It felt clean. That night, the camp gathered near the central fire. The guards stood among the prisoners without rifles, listening as the women sang again, this time louder, fuller. The melody filled the cold air, reaching into places O'Connor had thought frozen for good. Hayes handed him a tin cup of coffee. "Reckon we'll remember this one, eh?" O'Connor nodded slowly. "Yeah. One day folks'll say war was hell. But maybe they'll forget nights like this." Ingrid approached, holding something small in her hands, a torn scrap of paper folded neatly. She handed it to him. "For you," she said softly. He unfolded it. The handwriting was careful, childlike. In English it read, "Your hearts are warmer than your uniforms." O'Connor stared at it for a long time before folding it again and tucking it into his breast pocket. "Keep it safe," Williams murmured. "Something tells me no medal's ever gonna mean as much." Before dawn, movement at the gate woke the camp. A message runner from the regional command arrived, shouting for O'Connor. The war was shifting. The Allies had broken through the Ardennes, and new orders were in motion. Transfers, evacuations, redeployments. "This camp's being dissolved," the courier said. "Prisoners will be sent south within 48 hours. The word struck like the end of a long, fragile truce. As the sun rose, the trucks lined up outside. The women packed what little they owned, bits of cloth, tin mugs, fragments of hope. Ingrid lingered by the fence, her breath visible in the morning air. O'Connor approached, unsure what to say. She spoke first. "We go." "You go," he said quietly. War's almost over. She smiled faintly. Then maybe we meet again. No fence. He nodded, unable to answer. The engine started. One by one, the trucks rumbled away, shrinking into the pale horizon until the sound faded into wind. When it was over, the yard felt empty in a way battlefields never did. O'Connor stood with Williams beside the half-buried fire pit. The snow had begun again, slow and soft. Williams kicked at the ashes. Feels wrong letting it all vanish like this. O'Connor stared at the tracks fading under snow. It won't vanish, he said. Not what we did. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the folded note. The paper was creased, smudged, but the words were still clear. He read them once more, then tucked it back against his heart. That's all the history I need, he murmured. Williams looked up at the sky, flakes catching in his hair. Think anyone'll ever know what happened here? O'Connor smiled faintly. Doesn't matter if they do. What matters is someone lived because we remembered we could. The wind shifted again, carrying the faint scent of smoke and something like spring. For the first time, the camp didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a memory being born, fragile, fleeting, but alive. And as O'Connor turned away from the empty yard, he whispered the same words he'd said on the first night of mercy, the words that had changed everything. Rules be damned. We did right.